Hey everybody, this is a quick video I wanted to make in which I'm going to expand on some thoughts that I was having on my video I did with James from The Rational Rise on Nihilism. Now, that video was entirely off the cuff while I was on holidays, and so I was fairly unprepared for it, and I didn't say everything I might want to say, while also, I have received some emails and messages from people wanting to know if there's any literature expanding on this notion of self-mastery that I put forward in that talk, and to be honest, most of my ideas are my own thoughts, and there are a few texts I can really point to, but so I thought I'd do those people a favor and elaborate both on my own thoughts and who may have influenced them. Now, this video might seem kind of irrelevant to a lot of my audience. In fact, I would argue questions about the good life and value are of little interest to libertarians. It very much comes with the more cerebral and unemotional mindset that we have. Jonathan Haidt, a self-confessed libertarian, has conducted a wealth of research on personality and political ideology in a study Understanding Libertarian Morality, the psychological dispositions of self-identified libertarians. One of the most interesting conclusions is regarding how low the agreeableness of libertarians really is, being lower than that of both conservatives and liberals, while their conscientiousness is lower than both conservatives and liberals as well. And from this, ethical quarrels such as purity, the longing for sanctity, are very absent from the libertarian mindset. Statements such as, "I would call some act wrong on the grounds that they are unnatural," are foreign to the mind of the libertarian, while in addition, Haidt and his colleagues conclude that the low level of disgust sensitivity found in libertarians is consistent with previous research about the relationship between disgust and conservative attitudes on social issues, particularly those related to sexuality. Haidt writes that libertarians may not experience the flash of revulsion that drives moral condemnation in many cases of unorthodox behavior. And so, with all of these traits together, you get the position that man cannot expect compassion, that man is to have absolute moral agency in which he can never be victimized and be free simultaneously. A view of the world that seems harsh to liberals and insufficient and unsacred to conservatives. While also, when you combine these personality traits, you get someone that, as is reported in Haidt's research, has high levels of hedonism, higher than conservatives, and even higher than liberals, surprisingly. And for this reason, freedom is often portrayed in libertarian circles as not only being sufficient for happiness, something that is deeply wrong, and I'll explain why soon enough, but also, it is often portrayed in such a way as to appeal to the left, that is to simply mean license as opposed to property. You hear statements such as, "I want gay married couples defending their marijuana crops with guns," a slogan that if you remove guns from them, you are just left with an anti-conservative leftist talking point. And it is for these reasons that the libertarian writers of the last 100 or so years, or at least the Austro-libertarians who wrote in the tradition of Austrian economics, that is Mises, Rothbard, Hopper, and etc., and not the classical liberals or objectivists and so on, but amongst these authors, there is essentially zero literature on the question of meaning. There is zero construction of a positive good, and what things are said in conjunction with anything of value has a high focus on materialism and commerce, two things that make up few people's conception of the good life. Now, is this a failure of libertarianism? Perhaps on a strategic level, seeing that people in their religious natures are always going to be drawn to positive ideologies, which also means that all negative ones will eventually be infiltrated by a positive one, which could, also explain the intrusion of the alt-right into libertarian circles, as it would be a perfect example of a negative ideology acting as a gateway drug to a positive one. But moreover, I wouldn't say that it is a failure of libertarianism as a political philosophy, as it is important to say that libertarianism is inherently a negative system, thus making it insufficient for a complete doctrine of virtue. Similar to the Old Testament, it just gives bounds to people's actions that, if one is to comply with, they are simply good enough, but not truly good and certainly not great. So I wouldn't say libertarianism has failed in the sense that it hasn't achieved what it has set out to achieve, but seeing libertarianism is insufficient for virtue, I would also argue that it is subsequently insufficient for happiness, and to an extent that will be the focus of this video. Questions of finding happiness, meaning, fulfillment, and so forth. Questions that I cannot give you the answers to, but I have my own thoughts on, and, some people seem to at least be interested in that. So, it should be said that this video is mostly intended for a certain person. This video is about a certain character that is unique to many of the sorts of people watching this video. That man who, as Julius Evola wrote, finds himself involved in today's world, even at its most problematic and paroxysmal points. Yet he does not belong inwardly to such a world, nor will he give into it. He feels himself, in essence, as belonging to a different race from that of the overwhelming majority of his contemporaries. So, in other words, for disillusioned people who look back into the past with fondness. But it should also be said that this video is directed somewhat towards a secular audience, which is my fault because I don't even know if the majority of the people who watch my videos are atheists, but I'm sure my religious friends and viewers should also be able to get something of value from this. Now, the reason this video is intended for secular people is because it is unquestionable that the religious mind has the advantage of being safe from the tentacles of nihilism. They have the ultimate way to ride the tiger, so to speak, to reaffirm themselves of superior in the context of tragedy that is the modern world. I mean, it's always been the case that tradition is seen to come from something non-human, and so I suppose this video will be myself reflecting on that statement as an atheist. Now, I made a post on my Instagram recently that went along the lines of the following. When an atheist is based, they are far more based than any Christian. However, seeing most atheists aren't based, it is obvious Christianity is an essential pillar of civil society. The reason being that the struggle of finding meaning in a godless world is a task fulfilled by few. Except Christians, a group that profess to have found the ultimate fulfillment in God, I'm speaking mainly of Christians who were born into the institution, take their holy purpose and its doctrines for granted, and thus it is often unbeknownst to them that without it they could easily descend into nihilism. And then I continue to touch on similar issues to what I'm about to speak on now. And of course, when I say this, I'm not talking about all Christians. In my life personally, the most well-read people I know on these issues are the people from my local church. But nonetheless, as I also wrote on my Instagram, perhaps many atheists fall victim to a creeping nihilism due to replacing God with society. As isn't this the most intuitive means of finding a godless good? The largest thing above and beyond yourself that is immediately observable is, after all, the greater collective. The closest thing to something transcendent in a godless world is the legacy of humanity that you serve only a glimpse of. In some sense, this could be seen as God. But naturally, to define the good along societal lines is to neglect the individual and the self. This is to say that the religious doctrine of the transcendent offers an inner spiritual healthiness that is absent from the secular god of collectivism. It enables an inner structure and gives one's life a form and direction in which it is undeniable that the task of finding such spiritual fulfillment in the secular world is a great burden. But one of the most telling points of self-neglect amongst atheists is illustrated by the fact that in the secular world, you meet plenty of people who want to impose a vast number of duties and responsibilities on greater society, but seldom ask the same of themselves. And I think, as a millennial, this is especially true given that your 20s is a decade where most people are desperate to stand for something, to be seen as virtuous by their peers, except it often takes people a long time to actually know what this truly means. I know plenty of young people who are demanding climate action, chanting Black Lives Matter, and have a list of impositions that they wish to make on society, yet again, in their focus on the societal good, they have neglected themselves and make zero self-sacrifices. They impose zero duties or responsibilities on themselves. They have zero interest in moderation, sobriety, purity, sanctity, the theology of human relationships, and so forth. And it is beautifully ironic to see people who have a whole recipe on how to organize a virtuous society, yet have no idea how to organize themselves. Now, for those who do struggle with creeping nihilism and have realized that a loyalty to collectivism or modernity is not the way, why is traditionalism the answer? Firstly, I think there is something beautiful to the notion of being a libertarian and a traditionalist. I think there is humility in having most of the sacrifices and struggle that needs to be made in order to be good imposed only on yourself, and not to shift one's duties onto the state and therefore onto everyone else. But I think that the most persuasive writer on this is, of course, Julius Evola. Now, Evola premised a lot of his work in responding to Nietzsche, of who he was surprisingly charitable to. Now, Of course, Nietzsche is often incorrect and insufficient, and is perhaps even incoherent. However, his diagnosis of the world around him has value within it, and as I have said before, reflects a suspicion within all thinking men that is in some way to be conquered. In this sense, Nietzsche still offers a modern way to ride the tiger of modernity, but moreover, Nietzsche often talks about this idea of the death of God, the desacralization of existence, by which he means the point in time that man is no longer understood with any reference to transcendence, and both Evola and Nietzsche agreed that without man having something above him, he would be content in slouching down into a dark, amoral, truthless world. So this is to say, again, the facets of nihilism are well contained within the lack of reference to man as transcendent. Existence is reduced to itself and its naked reality, without any reference point outside itself that could give it a real meaning for man. Often Nietzsche is quoted with saying, "What ought to be is not, and what is what ought to be," and this is what Nietzsche called the tragic phase of nihilism. It is the beginning of the misery of man without God. And to illustrate, in Ride the Tiger, Evola writes, quote, "Friedrich Nietzsche is the one who best foresaw European nihilism as a future and a destiny which proclaims itself everywhere by the voice of 1,000 signs and 1,000 presages. The great event, obscurely suspected that God is dead, is the principle of the collapse of all values. From this point, morality is deprived of its sanction and incapable of maintaining itself, and the interpretation and justification formerly given to all norms and values disappear." End quote. But perhaps what is secondary to the death of God is the death of internal restraint, which to me is the real meaning of nihilism. As Evola said, the chains of traditional life did not bind man, but sustained him. And this draws back to the notion I put forward with James from The Rational Rise, that of self-sacrifice and finding meaning not in freedom, but imposing duties and responsibilities on oneself. And the sacrifice simply being the opportunity cost involved in doing so, in being an upstanding, principled person. Maybe this will be clearer in reference to Evola's work and the way he writes of tradition and the traditional man. In Evola's text, The Path of Cinnabar, he writes, quote, "I identified the foundation of the world of tradition with the doctrine of two natures, a doctrine based on the notion of the existence of two opposing orders, a physical order and a metaphysical. The latter order represents the superior realm of being, opposed to the lower realm of becoming and of history, an immortal nature opposed to the perishable. The man of tradition does not perceive this doctrine as merely a theory, but rather as a directly verifiable existential truth. Each traditional civilization is thus characterized by an attempt to lead man from the lower order of reality to the higher along various stages of approximation, participation, and effective realization. Originally, at the center of each traditional civilization stood immanent transcendence, the concrete presence of a non-human transcendent force embodied in higher beings possessing the highest authority. Perhaps the chief expressions of this idea are ancient forms of divine kingship. The most common means of passing from the lower nature to the higher has always been initiation. Contemplation and heroic action represent two great paths based on an approximation to the highest order, loyalty and ritual. Two means of sharing in such an order. The higher order of reality has always found a support in traditional law, with its objective and suprapersonal character, and has symbolically been expressed by the traditional state or empire, a worldly and historical reflection of that which transcends the world. Such, then, are the foundations of traditional hierarchies and civilizations." End quote. So you can see, in Evola's view, tradition is a concept analogous to any other metaphysical truth, in that tradition has no provisions or is dependent on any point in history. The traditional culture is one that can be lived for all of time, and this is reiterated when Evola speaks of the traditional man as representing being, in which he reflects on this principle of tradition and tries to embody it and applies that principle universally, while in contrast, the modern man represents becoming, and that in his belief that there is nothing above him, nothing transcendent, he lives according to nothing but his own desires, and he will never subjugate his feelings or desires for something higher than himself that is more eternal. And of course, this leads to a life that is unstructured, formless, reducible, and that's inner character shows little trajectory or direction. To quote Robert Reininger, this is a struggle for the sake of modern man, that man who no longer has any roots in the sacred soil of tradition, wavering in search of himself between the peaks of civilization and the abysses of barbarism, trying to find satisfactory meaning for an existence completely left to itself. Now, for me, especially as an atheist that would subsequently fall in line with a lot of what Nietzsche had to say about man's misery without God, I think a stoic understanding of happiness makes the traditional life have reward in this world, and thus have justification from within oneself and not above them. The sacrifice that comes with sobriety, sexual purity, and so forth is good, not only because it is virtuous, but because it offers a deeper sense of meaning and happiness than the alternatives. To explain what I'm referring to when I say Stoicism, I'm simply referring to the philosophical movement of the Hellenistic period, but more specifically the later Stoics of Roman imperial times, such as Seneca and Epictetus, who emphasized the idea that the sage, the person who had achieved intellectual and moral perfection, finds virtue both sufficient and necessary for happiness, this being because the only conception of the positive good are human excellences rather than possessions that may be preferable or desirable, but not ultimately good, a distinction often made by the Stoics. While secondly, the claim that the justification for any conception of a positive good must come from something above and beyond oneself can be put to rest if one adopts an Aristotelian axiology. The only reason the struggle of the principled man, or really the struggle for anything, comes to be is as a condition of existence, that is, of life, of being a living, breathing, and thinking person, which is to say there is no value exterior to life. Perhaps there is something transcendent, but how is it to be valued without life to, well, value it? And this is also to say that death is not consequential, but life is ultimately consequential and ultimately valuable. While thirdly, it is also important to understand that tradition isn't coming back. You are a man amongst the ruins, and the old world is not to be revived. And this is very stressful to many people. But although tradition is dead, it can and must still be learned from, and there is value to extract from it. I mean, perhaps the West is dead. You could say the West is dead and we have killed it. That is the intellectual and cultural frontier of our time, just as the death of God was the frontier of Nietzsche's. But again, our goal shouldn't be to revive the old world, but to build something greater from its ashes, in a phoenix-like rebirth. Which is to say, to not neglect your moment in history. Tradition should be spoken more intimately with virtue, and subsequently, happiness. For it is self-discipline, not arbitrary cultural submission that gives man wings. To quote Evola in Ride the Tiger again, we now find ourselves writhing in the depths of utter despair, without any remaining spiritual vitality to arise on its own, the sacred nobility of our blood having been rationalized away into nothing more than mere biological fluid. All institutional centers of spiritual initiation have been burnt and left smoldering in the shadow of our consciousness. All that remains is profane idols and dead rituals. The temple of the gods gave way to sepulchres. Alas, rejoice, no politician is coming to save us. There is no democratic solution. So stop sitting on your hands, arise, rediscover your inner divinity, give life to your spirit. Dance, damn you, draw the sword and throw away the scabbard. The modern world gives you the opportunity to ride the tiger, to explore this vast and decadent wilderness as an adventurer, as a hero, a chance to overcome the poison of this world by transforming it into medicine. Place upon yourself the joyous burden of this struggle and never lose yourself to the forces of darkness. Revolt from the ruins, not to resurrect an already dead past, but to breathe the eternal life of our forebears into a new future." End quote. And I think this goes in hand with Stoic and Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who in Meditations offers some famous words of wisdom, one of which being that you can divide this world into that which you can change and that which you cannot, and modernity is simply something that won't be stopped by you or I. In fact, it could be that modernity will only come to a halt when civilization lays in ashes, but the fact that it In this dichotomy, it is something that cannot be changed by you or I alone. It also follows that there is no reward for feeling despair. There is nothing to be gained from fretting that others won't join you in your self-conquest and the struggle of asserting yourself in the context of tragedy that is the modern world. To sum up this video, I should just say that the examined life is worth living. Thank you. Check the description for all my social media links, merch, Patreon, and so forth, and catch you guys next time.